Hello, I'm speaking to you today on Monday, the 27th of April, 2020. I'm going to share with you today what I like to call London's historic Jewish district. This is the area in which London's Jews lived and prayed from the middle of the 17th century until at least the middle of the 18th century and beyond. And so I'm going to share with you how the community grew up around this area during the times of what we call the Readmission, when Jews began to resettle this area during the times of Oliver Cromwell, the Lord Protector. Down to my right is Church Street, where on the end you can see St. Catherine's Cree Church. To my left is Berry Street, where you can also see today the Gherkin, and up kind of ahead of me where you have Cree Church, off to the side is Heneage Lane, where today Bevis Marks Synagogue stands, and at the very far at the top of the road is the Rhodes Duke's Place, which then turns into Bevis Marks. And of course, the spot in which I'm standing is the location of where the community had its first synagogue here on Cree Church Lane during the times the Readmission. The synagogue was set up on the second floor of where would have been the building that would have been here at that time. And the synagogue would have been in somebody's home, Antonio Carvajal, and it's what historians refer to as house worship, as opposed to what would then be Bevis Marks, which is hidden off of the main street, would be known as private worship. And then, of course, what we think of today of synagogues being public and being very visible, right? That's what we know historians refer to as public worship. For example, think of the synagogue, the Snocha in Amsterdam, right, which is very public. That would have been the case. And so while this was the area in which Jews lived, of course, they still kept a bit of a low profile in what would have been Protestant country that would have had quite a lot of kind of conflicts between different religious groups, nonconformists, and so the Jews kept that low profile first with a house synagogue and then with a private synagogue at Bevis Marks. And so what I'd like to do is to help you understand how these streets all make sense historically, where the names of the streets come from, and what you'll find, and this is one of the things that's remarkable, is that the Jewish area actually was established on what used to be church land before the different monasteries and abbeys were dissolved during the times of Henry VIII in the first half of the 16th century, and then a century later, middle of the 17th century, Jews began to live in this area. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go with you to just around the corner to a street that's called Mitre Street and what's called Mitre Square, where there are some maps on display there, and I'm going to use that to show you how the neighborhood has shifted from those medieval times until those early modern times to the area that we know today. And so I'm going to speak with you now from this placard here in Mitre Square to explain to you a bit more about how the streets were. I'm going to zoom in and just point with my finger as I speak. Here we are looking at a map from 1676. And what I'm going to show you is how the streets reflected the history of the area and the way that we know it today. And so before the times of Henry VIII, this land had all been part of the Catholic Church. And this area over here, what today's Duke's Place, and then Leadenhall Street, and down Cree Church Lane, this whole area was part of the Priory of Holy Trinity. And in fact, there's also on this map a depiction of what that had looked like. And so I'll just show that to you as well. So here's a depiction of what the Priory looked like. And again, this is what would become known as Duke's Place. And this over here is Aldgate. Down over here would be Leadenhall Street. And of course, this would be Cree Church Street, right, which essentially would be the perimeter. And this over here would eventually become, afterwards, after the dissolution, would become St. Cree Church, where a different building stands today from the 17th century. And down along this over here, which was the nave, this would actually become Mitre Street, and this little space over here, this courtyard, is still today is what we call Mitre Square, which is still a park. And so in addition to the priory, over here was the Abbey of Bury St. Edmunds, and this land was given over to, this land was divided. This land was given over to Thomas Heneage. This land was given over to the Duke of Norfolk, which is why this street became known as Duke's Place. And of course, because this had been the Bury of St. Edmunds, this was known as Bury Street. And this lane over here became known as Heneage Street. But again, because it had been a bury, this originally probably had been Bevis Marks, meaning the edge of the Abbey of Bury St. Edmunds, and eventually became Bevis Marks, or some people call it Bevis Marks, over time. And so it was on the corner over here after everything, after the times of Readmission, where Jews set up the synagogue on Cree Church Lane, which is where I was standing from you before in the house. And then later, by end of the 17th century, they built an actual synagogue, but a private synagogue in what was already a courtyard in this land over here, just off of what became known as Heneage Lane, because it had previously been the land of Thomas Heneage. And so amazingly, this whole land, which once had been land of the church, eventually became the area of where the synagogue was. And of course, in the 18th century, it was on Duke's Place where the Ashkenazi community built their synagogue, which became known as London's Great Synagogue as well, or Duke's Place Synagogue, based on the name of the street. Thank you for joining me today in what was London's historic Jewish district. Continue to be well, and I look forward to speaking to you soon.